While surfing the internet, I came to face with an exposed video about a new analog horror that caught my attention for easily being one of the most interesting analog horrors for now. And after watching it, I surely was down for a hell of a ride. In this video, I'll be deep diving into not one, but two analog horrors that will get your attention. I'm Sir Chris, I explore the internet, mostly analog horrors, and I make videos about it. Let's go. Chapter 1: VHS Tales. The Circles tells us about a macabre phenomenon that takes place in a small village in Alaska called REPULSIVE on December 5th of 1986. In it, it introduces us to one of the village's residents, Ethan Astor, who confirms that the village suffers from a curse which causes figures to appear from time to time. Apparently, these figures are so harmful that when they are about to appear, the village only has one day to evacuate, or the people who decide to stay are never seen again. But now, how or why, we still don't know. But with that, Ethan decides to stay. Then, we see a letter that was left for Ethan on December 10th of 1986 from a woman called Martha. Ethan, this is going too far. I no longer feel comfortable around you. You haven't spoken to me or left the basement for days now. By the time you read this, I'll be far away. Please seek help. After a few shots, the camera focuses on a door that later on we realize that it was the basement door. Inside, Ethan was staring at the circles on the wall. And that night, the programming that appeared on the television in the living room is interrupted by the curse that strikes in the village. Someone is knocking on the basement door. These knocks quickly turn into him trying to break down the door. Then, some drawings appear which I think are the projection of Ethan's ideas, which tells us that it was a cycle of destruction and rebirth, a cycle that was now born and couldn't be broken, but yet it exists, and Ethan's old body becomes one grotesque form of the circles. But before I say anything, the description has something to tell us. Ethan Astor is a famous photographer from REPULSIVE, Alaska. On December 5th of 1986, his wife, Martha Astor, reported that her husband was showing a strange obsession with circles. He would constantly draw the shapes on the walls of their basement. He refused to eat, sleep, or talk to Martha. But Ethan wasn't the only one dealing with such obsession. The government issued an emergency evacuation for REPULSIVE a day before this strange incident. All of REPULSIVE's citizens evacuated, except for the obsessed ones. Martha returned days later, only to find out that her husband, along with dozens of other people who decided to stay, was gone. Wow, what a strong beginning. So, The Circles tells us about a town that suffers from a curse in Alaska. This curse, that appears from time to time, means that the village always has to be evacuated when it's about to happen. Strangely enough, whoever lives there knows in advance when this phenomenon is going to happen. I suppose that the figures start to appear 5 days before, or several people start showing the same obsession with the figures, which later of course alerts other residents. When the figures capture the attention of the curious, they become obsessed, lose their minds, and eventually turn into one of them. Next, we have the Starving Five, which opens with a cryptic and interesting phrase while showing us an abomination. An exiled spirit, rejected from the domains of the afterlife. The earth repudiates its flesh, preventing it from rotting. Damned with an endless hunger, a mouth that can't eat, and a throat that can't swallow. Its objective, to bring upon the decay of man's flesh and ego. 7 days after what happened in the town of REPULSIVE, 4 people end up staying inside a small wooden shack in the middle of the forest, starving and struggling to stay warm. No matter how much they hear animals nearby, when they go outside, they don't find anything. And with the following text, we finally get their names. Gary heard his lover's call. Natasha followed him blindly. Alex dreams unquietly. I watched the rumbling snow attentively. With the last sentence, we realize that they were not starving alone. In the middle of the storm, Dimitri is woken up by the knocks on the window and notices that the cabin door was open. A question is asked. The anxious dreamer wanders unconsciously. Will you follow him? Without him saying anything, Dimitri grabs the last weapon and goes into the night. Then, a call between Alex and Dimitri that happened on December 17th appears. In this conversation, we realize that Gary's wife disappeared on November 17th and 1 month had already passed since the investigations began. But even without finding anything, Gary was still holding on to hope that she was alive out there. Despite this conversation, Alex, Dimitri, Natasha, and Gary agree to continue searching for her, even though the previous searches led to nothing. And finally we get to see what happened to Dimitri. Dimitri, following the footsteps through the forest, sees the bodies of his previous friends in the distance, before being attacked by the entity. But the torture doesn't end there, because this creature, instead of ending his suffering, puts him in a vicious cycle where both starve for days and days. But the difference between them is that the entity can't die, but Dimitri can and will. The description doesn't say much and simply leaves us to interpret, but thankfully, this one isn't that hard to make sense of. The starting five tells us about the disappearance of Gary's wife in November of 1986. With that incident, Gary, Dimitri, Alex, and Natasha ended up searching for her for a month, until on December 17th, while they were looking for her, the engine of their car died. As it was getting late and a snowstorm was starting, the four ended up taking refuge in their only option, the wooden cabin. Horrible mistake. During the night, the entity starts taking them down one by one. I say this because when Dimitri woke up, the room in which he woke up was completely empty, one of the two guns was gone, and the cabin door was open. If this was still not enough to convince you, before Dimitri died, he saw 3 different bodies. And if we read the last sentences, they tells us how they died. Chapter 2, Oakburn Opus. This new series starts differently. Oakburn Opus begins with a mysterious case from a neighboring village close to Widow Civic, whose population had disappeared, Oakburn, in which the classified documents of this case end up being leaked in 2024, and thus showing the evidence of this mystery. Firstly, the perpetrator. In an analog horror, when we talk about an entity capable of making hundreds of people disappear, your head definitely thinks about something like this. Or maybe this. And how are they going to do that? By disguising themselves as people you once knew? Or maybe seeking them out in the middle of the night? In Oakburn Opus, this is our perpetrator and Martha's first evidence. For now, it goes by the name of the Oakburn Flutist. The tape tells us that this entity appeared in the Oakburn village and quickly gained a good reputation among the townspeople through the melody of its flute. But little did they knew what actually was happening. Within the wind it hid fangs. Within the wind it breached our spirit. Within the wind, the flute burned the veil. The second evidence was the flutist's magnum opus, or in simple words, his most important work. With the most important music ready, the same entity asks everyone to come together for the night so that everyone can listen. And that night, when the music plays, the town's fate was sealed. 1043 disappeared without a trace. It was all a facade. This episode is what made me like this series. The entity did not appear to be a threat right away, despite its weird appearance. The lengths that the entity went through just to make their guard down, like even honoring altars? Not only that, but the fact that it's a melody so captivating that it makes you curious enough to get closer until it is too late. Such a breath of fresh air, to be honest. Part 2. The next tape continues where we left off. It shows us the third evidence, which was the 2 homicides that took place at the Lebedev's residence on December 10th of 2003. After arresting the suspect, detectives call him John Doe as they were unable to identify him. During the interrogation, with John's answers, the following timeline of events is constructed. On December 5th of 2003, John ends up hearing a melody coming from Oakburn Lake. Following the sound, he ends up finding a monolith that had a symbol, and he also found the flutist. I witnessed the flute and the man. They taught me wisdom from the bottom of the lake, the drowned city, and the millions who rest there. He raised me in that instant as a vessel. John will never be the same. He would wander through the mountains for 5 days until he came across the Lebedev's house 40 kilometers away, in which at that moment he broke into the house at 11:42 p.m. and took their lives. Oliver dies at 12:07 a.m. by a pickaxe, and Jackson dies at 12:16 a.m. by a gun. Something doesn't feel right, and I'll tell you why at the end of this tape. But after John Doe recounted these events, John, under the influence of the flutist's spell, now called Morpheus, says that the only reason he gave himself up was to give Martha Morpheus' message that will eventually give us a foreshadowing. And finally, the rest of the police analysis appears. The bodies, after being analyzed, contradict what John had said, with the true cause being drowning, and only one of the 2 police cars returns the street they came from. Okay, let's take this slow. This tape tells us about the greatest evidence that the police have of the Oakburn case, the murder of the Lebedev brothers who lived 40 kilometers away from the village, in which after the homicides, Morpheus, the Oakburn flutist, tells his vessel, John, to turn himself in and give a message to the detective, Martha Astor, the same woman who lost her husband in 1986, and somehow Morpheus knows her. And trust me, this will get more questionable later. And now, the strangest part. What really happened inside of the Lebedev's house? Before John entered the house, we could see that he was with Morpheus, and he had a pickaxe. If John was telling the truth, then he, with a pickaxe, ended up attacking the brothers at 11:42 p.m., which leaves Jackson's femur broken, and now with a gun, John forces Oliver to drag Jackson to the dark room, where 30 minutes later, they both lose their lives. And eventually, John gives himself up, in which we see 2 police cars going, and only one coming back. And why would John need 2 rounds for Jackson, especially when he was debilitated? He has to be lying. You see, the autopsies insinuated that they had been drowned. The investigation did not mention the supposed broken femur, which would have been very visible, and the only gun that was collected on the scene was the pistol. Unless, if Morpheus makes whoever was attacked by his vessels appear bloated as a way of transmitting the message of the drowned city. But I might be going too far with this one. And now we go to the last episode, and the most interesting of them all. The land remained still, accursed by a tragic silence for over 5 years. The last tape begins by talking about how quiet and abandoned the Oakburn village was, with echoes of what was once a lively village. 1 year before the homicides that we saw in the previous tape, Martha goes on a mission alone to explore a specific area in Oakburn, the monolith. When she gets there, Martha discovers a trapdoor, or as she says, a tombstone. Despite the putrid smell of rotten flesh, she begins to descend through the tunnel. The tunnel eventually leads her to an underwater building, which contained again another useful piece of evidence, the Morpheus book. The Morpheus book had a story that we had already seen, that of the drowned artist. But the most interesting thing is that, at the end, it had Martha's name on top of a symbol which is connected to her. It was Martha's curse. Martha eventually looks back and realizes that she was not alone. With both looking each other in the eyes, the episode ends with the following text. Our bane, our sigils, our blood and roots are shared. Shall us recall those times? Or have you grown to abhor our very nature? Those wrathful days, as I held your lifeless corpse, when in that lake I communed with beings far beyond. I contested death itself and welcomed the vile force to bathe this land in blasphemy. And those who skinned the lungs of mine will scream in the void the name of the beast that sung, Morpheus. And the video ends with the symbol of Martha Ludolph Astor, who was born in 1852, and Matthias Ludolph, who was also born in that same year and died in 1897, and the day of the wrath of Oakburn, which was certainly the cause of Matthias' death. Theory time. Okay, buckle up. This is going to be a long timeline. In the universe of Red Diamond, several tragic incidents occur in 2 specific parts of Alaska in different years. Edo Civic, in 1986, suffers from a paranormal phenomenon that is extremely harmful to its residents. Those who are affected become obsessed and eventually turn into a grotesque shape identical to the circles and disappear. This phenomenon happens once again on December 5th of 1986, where one of those affected is Martha Astor's husband, Ethan Astor. Martha, devastated by the incident, I assume that she joined the IPD to further explore these paranormal cases. Around November 17th of that same year, Gary's wife, probably one of the inhabitants of Edo Civic, ends up mysteriously disappearing, which causes investigations to be carried out, but sadly to no avail. One of these investigations took place on December 21st, marking it as the most tragic search, as it led to the death of 4 more by another cruel entity. Things seemed to calm down until 1997. In a village not far from Edo Civic, a former artist who was mysteriously drowned in 1897 ends up making a pact with an elderly being and decides to take revenge. Without showing hostility, without chasing or scaring them away, he captures the attention of the victims through the melody of the flute. Eventually, the artist is introduced to the village and quickly gains an excellent reputation. In addition to bringing entertainment and happiness, he adapted to the customs of those who live there so as to not arouse suspicion, until eventually it was too late, and in one night, Morpheus makes 1043 inhabitants disappear. With no one left in the village, the Eurocivic Police Department starts looking for the missing people, but they only find manuscripts, tapes, newspapers, etc. and sadly hit a dead end. In 2002, Martha ends up exploring the monolith area with the intention of finding more evidence, in which she is successful. And even after she crosses paths with Morpheus, a person she once knew, Martha somehow comes out unscathed. Or that's what it seems like. One of the strangest things is that this happens in 2002, and somehow the book is the fourth piece of evidence and not the third. Did she held that book for a while before eventually giving it as evidence? We don't know. In 2003, a man under the same influence of the flutist's melody ended up killing two brothers, and then called the police and confessed his crime. John Doe is arrested and interrogated by Martha, and with the answers, finally the case comes forward with new evidence. A confirmation that Morpheus was still out there and he wasn't afraid of showing up. And lastly, in 2024, these documents end up being leaked by an anonymous person. But with this timeline, several questions still remain. Is Martha a human? Why is her symbol an upward arrow and Morpheus' symbol is 9 downwards? That most likely proves that Martha is a force of good. Why was Matthias drowned in 1897, and how will the story proceed from here? But Morpheus will remain in the unseen parts of the forest, because we are left in the dark for now. If you watched the video to the very end, what about one analog horror from almost every state? If you love this analog horror, please support Red Diamond, he truly deserves it. A huge thanks to our Patreon supporter Pawn, and you viewer, for watching to the very end. And take care, my friend.